Thank you, Mark, for embarrassing me. So now that I've opened my mouth, I will, you can obviously say I'm from around these parts, sort of the other side of the water, but it's a real pleasure for me to be back. Thank you to Gareth and the team for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back here and to talk to you on this subject, science and Christianity, friends or foes. I mean, Mark was saying that I've been in Oxford for most of my working life, but I started off my working life really in London, as you were saying, and just after my wife and I got married, we moved to London. And as you probably know, once you've got somebody living in London, everybody from Northern Ireland wants to come and visit you, which they did. And we used to take people to all the sites, and I remember very well one time, it was near Easter, I think a year or two after we moved there, we went to St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the sites to be seen, and when we went in, we noticed, if you've ever been to St. Paul's Cathedral, you know what an impressive building it is, and under the dome, they had built a huge rocky mound and put upon a huge cross. It was around Easter, of course, and round the cross they put a white shroud that swept all the way up to the dome, hundreds of feet above. Spectacular looking. I was intrigued about what it was meant to represent, and so I asked one of the wee men who walked about in the black gowns what this was meant to show, and he said, this shows how Jesus died on the cross, and then he came back to life and flew off the cross up to heaven. And I was just about to say, that wasn't quite the way I remembered the story. But he went on. But of course, nobody believes that today, because science has shown that was impossible. Oh, I said, that's interesting. How did science prove that? And he said, well, it's very complicated. Well, I said, well, actually, I'm studying science myself, so maybe you could explain the science to me. And he said, well, look, when you're finished your studies, then you'll understand. Before my hair went white. So I said, well, actually, I have finished my studies and I'm working at Imperial College doing research, so could you explain the science to me, how that proved Jesus couldn't have done that? Well, he said, real scientists don't believe it. Now that was sort of 50 years ago nearly, of course, but things haven't really changed that much. A lot of people just think that science has proven that Christianity is false, and that science really is an enemy of Christian faith and any religious faith at all. That science has proved that there is no God, and people who believe in him are deluded. And this is a common theme today. You get it on TV and in newspapers and books that scientists write that convey this impression that science has proved that there is no God. And of course, one of the most famous scientists who evokes this is our friend Richard Dawkins from Oxford, and he writes this, that when science looks at the universe, somebody says the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, no nothing, but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, from a scientific view of the universe, there is no God. Now that's, he purports to say this is a finding of science, and what I want to ask us to do tonight is to think a bit more about that, because actually this idea that science leads to atheism has been around for quite a long time. In fact, it's quite easy to get the impression studying science that there is no God. And this was recognized at the beginning of the modern science era, none other than Francis Bacon, who was sometimes known as the father of experimental science. He introduced the scientific method, how to do experiments to test theories and so on to prove whether they were right or wrong. And Bacon wrote this, which I thought was very interesting. A little philosophy, that's what they meant by science in those days, a little natural philosophy inclineth man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy bringeth men's mind about to religion. So, right from the beginning of modern science, you get this impression that if you look at it at first sight, it seems to prove that there's no God. But let's think a little bit more deeply, shall we, about it. Think about the kind of reasons that people quote for why science is the enemy of Christianity, why it undermines faith, why it proves there is no God. Let's think of some of the ideas that people have put forward. First of all, for example, it says, we have discovered that the universe is so vast and we are so small and insignificant that we are on a planet, a small planet, around a pretty ordinary star that's one of 100 billion in a galaxy, which is one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And we are in this little tiny speck, somewhere about halfway out towards the edge of it. Nothing special. And therefore, there's no significance to our being here. That's what science seems to show to us. Secondly, we now know where the universe came from. It came from what's now called the Big Bang, this primordial explosion that occurred about 13.7 billion years ago. And the whole universe has grown from this expansion and the energy condensing into matter, forming stars and galaxies. And we now know where it came from. It didn't come from God, it came from this Big Bang. And then thirdly, people say that the theory of evolution shows how life has come to be. And the Bible is just got wrong about the origin of life. And Darwin's theory explains everything we need to know about how life exists, and we don't need God. That's the wrong idea. And then again, people say that in my field, as in physics, that the laws of nature show that miracles cannot happen, because to do so would to break the laws of physics. And therefore miracles are just impossible. And therefore people who say that they've happened are deluded. And science has proved that miracles can never happen. And then eventually, when you get right down to it, scientists will tell you that when you analyse what we are, we turn out to be just a bunch of atoms and molecules. That we're made up of base elements formed into molecules, and that's all there is. When you get right down to it, that's what we're made of, complicated bundles of atoms. And so there's nothing spiritual about us. We're just a kind of complicated animal made up of stuff that happens to have this shape and behave the way we do. There's no spiritual value or nature in us. And all these things add together. Some of the most strongest arguments that scientists use to prove there is no God. Now, the thing is that if we, sorry, trying to make the thing to work here. Let's have a look at each one of those in a little more depth, shall we? Okay. Let's take the first one. The universe is so vast, and we are so small, we can't be very important. And I think what we've done here, we've smuggled in the idea that to be important, you have to be big. That the bigger you are, the more important you are. There's some kind of link between size and importance or significance. So that means that an elephant is a little bit more important and significant than your pet dog. Even a little bit. Or your leg is more important than your brain because it's bigger. Or your position. You have to be at the centre to be important. Now that would mean, of course, that the most important place in Northern Ireland is Cookstown. Now no offence to people from Cookstown here, but that's probably not true, is it? So the position and the size of a place or a thing has no logical connection to its importance or its significance. So this idea that because the universe is so vast, actually people in ancient times knew it was big anyway. They just didn't put a number on it. The idea that the size gives you significance is a logical fallacy. There's no connection between the two. So, big doesn't mean important, and being central doesn't mean important. Our significance, the value and significance of our life has nothing to do with our position in the universe. And let's think about the origin of the universe in the Big Bang. It explains how, I got my little widget to work here. Right back at the beginning of time here, there was this sudden explosion. In the first 3 minutes, it expanded enormously at huge speed, and at that instant, both space and time came into being.
So that over the succeeding minutes and hours and days and months, eventually years, as the universe expanded, the matter condensed into, from fundamental particles into protons and neutrons and electrons that make up atoms. And then gravity pulled them together, and the hydrogen atoms got squeezed together, and they stuck together and made helium. Then helium stuck together to make other elements. And as it went on, we built up in the center of stars, all the elements that we need for life and the universe that we observe. So we can basically understand that everything has evolved over this 13.5 billion years, and we don't need God to explain it. So what's wrong with that? Well, even the most prominent and brilliant scientists who have studied this problem realize at the end of the day there's still an unresolved issue. That one of the people who's responsible for this Big Bang theory in its final form is none other than Stephen Hawking, who everybody must have heard of. Stephen Hawking wrote this in his book: "The usual approach of science, constructing a mathematical model, cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing?" In other words, we can describe the mechanism of how things have evolved over time, and stars formed and how elements formed and so on, but that doesn't explain why it happened in the first place. And the other interesting scientific issue, of course, is that people say that the Big Bang came out of nothing. Before that there was no space or time or nothing. But actually, as Hawking himself says, what there was a vacuum that's fluctuating, and the rules of quantum mechanics meant that a fluctuation suddenly expanded, and some kind of asymmetry was built in so that there was more matter than antimatter, and everything grew from there. But the laws of quantum theory and gravity and so on existed right at the very beginning. Where did they come from? We don't know. Why did they come from? We don't know. This is a question that science cannot answer. So Hawking recognizes this, although he doesn't take the next step and say there must be some mind or some force behind it that brought it into existence. But what he's addressing is the very fundamental question about our existence that was put by Gottfried Leibniz, a colleague of Isaac Newton, who developed calculus and the theory of gravity and so on. And Leibniz said this: why is there something rather than nothing? And this puts his finger on the basic flaw that when Christianity talks about creation, it talks about God bringing things into existence. It's not talking about the mechanism of how he did that. He's saying we exist because of an act of God. It's not a scientific statement, it's a statement of significance. And why there's something rather than nothing, there's no answer that science can give. But theism of some kind or other posits a mind, a super mind behind the universe that brought it into being and laid down the laws of quantum theory and gravity and so on that caused the universe to be what we observe today in our scientific studies. So the fact that we understand the Big Bang does not of itself rule out the existence of God. So it's not an enemy in that case. So let's move on to creation, as I'm saying, means bringing into existence, not the mechanism of how stars are formed and so on. So the next one is a theory of evolution explains life. Everybody knows by now that this was an idea brought up by Charles Darwin to explain how different animals and different species have come into being. And you may be familiar with this diagram which shows the common ancestor of humanity, and various pre-human forms have been found in the fossil records, and it shows a development from some kind of ape-like ancestor, and the branch of life that we're on has developed into humans that we see here. Makes you wonder, what the next stage of our evolution might be. Some people suggest it might be something like this. But one of the reasons why evolution is used as an argument against Christianity is that it seems to say we don't need God to explain how we've come to being. But again, this makes a similar kind of basic mistake of what evolution, the theory of evolution, is doing. And it was, in fact, accepted by many Christians at the time. One of Darwin's close friends, Charles Kingsley, a teacher in the university and a theologian, wrote to him and said that we knew of old that God was so wise that he could make all things. But behold, he is so much wiser than even that he can make all things make themselves. So what Kingsley was recognizing even at the very beginning, the time when Darwin produced this theory, was that this is a mechanism of our coming into being, of how we're changed from one type into another. It's not giving the whole reason why we're here. It's a scientific description of the method of how we have come to be the way we are. And it doesn't necessarily rule out God. This might just be the method which God uses to bring us into being, and that's one way of thinking of it. So that we can move on to the next one, which is laws of nature mean that miracles are impossible. And this is sort of coming close to home, because many scientists think that when you get right down to it, we can explain everything by physics of atoms and molecules. Even biology and chemistry can be explained by physics. And actually, there's a story told of an American visitor to Oxford who noticed that going around with a group of Christians, there seemed to be more physicists amongst his group of Christians than biologists or chemists. He wondered why that was, and he came up with this idea that biologists think they don't have all the answers, but the chemists do, because basically it's chemistry going on. It tells you how biology works. And the chemists realised, no, we don't really, but the physicists do, because at rock bottom the laws of physics determine what the atoms and molecules do. Well, the physicists, they know they don't have all the answers, because they're right at the edge of what we can know about the fundamental nature of reality. And so physicists tend to be more open-minded to other ways of looking at things, and they realise the limitations of science. When you're a physicist, you realise you're up against the limits of what we can know. A famous physicist once said that the universe is not only stranger than we know, maybe stranger than we can know. There's a limit to what we may be able to ever discover about the universe. So physicists tend to be a wee bit more open to spiritual realities and other non-physical realities. But we'll come back to that. Because the argument was that because there are these laws of nature, they can't be broken, and therefore a miracle is impossible. Another Belfast man, actually a very famous scientist who was born in Belfast, was none other than Lord Kelvin, and he said this: and the laws of nature mean, like the law of gravity, means that heavier than air flying machines are impossible. Because gravity would mean that anything heavier than air would fall to the ground. That's the law of nature. We know that's not true. I got here on an airplane, a heavier than air machine, and even Kelvin should have known better. He'd seen birds flying about. But for him, the law of gravity meant that the miracle of flight was impossible, because he didn't know about the laws of aerodynamics. That if you design a wing so that the air flows faster over the top than it does along the bottom, then the pressure on the top is lower than on the bottom, and you get lift. And that's a law of nature as well. The laws of aerodynamics overcome the law of gravity and make the miracle of flight possible. There isn't really a miracle, it's just use of a different law to overcome another law of nature. And that's perhaps one way that we might think about the miracles that we experience, or that other people have experienced, that God can use laws of nature that we don't know about. Because there's a limit to what we know. And in fact, when we get to know more about it, we discover that it really is mysterious. I got involved with some work with some colleagues in Paris, where we used our lasers to take helium atoms. Now, a helium atom has a core with 2 protons and 2 neutrons in it, and 2 electrons running around it. And they look identical, but they're not, because at the center there's this little nucleus which is spinning. And it can spin in totally random directions. So that means you can tell one helium atom from another because of the direction it's spinning. So you get these 2 atoms that collide together, and because they're different because of the spin, they bump into each other, and the electricity forces them apart. That's why you don't fall through your seat. The electric force between the atoms in your body and your seat prevent you going through it. So we can't walk through walls, for example. Don't try it, okay? What we were able to do was take our lasers and make the little nuclei all point in the same direction. And that meant every helium atom in our bottle was exactly the same. And then, what do you know? The laws of quantum mechanics say that if the two atoms are in exactly the same quantum state, they can't be in the same place at the same time. So when they came to collide, they sort of disappeared and appeared on the other side. It was like a miracle. It was like the helium going through a wall. And we could measure that, we could see it. So the laws of quantum mechanics overruled the laws of electromagnetism that would stop somebody walking through a wall. If you could get molecules into a state, it's possible. And nowadays, we're doing experiments like that in the lab, making atoms pass right through each other. So, the laws of nature are the ones we know about, aren't everything that there is to know. And it's possible that other laws can be used by God to make what we would call a miracle. So that invoking the supernatural, as it were, to explain a miracle is not absolutely necessary. Because you may be interested to know that the people who wrote the Bible didn't believe in the supernatural either. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but some people tell me that in Hebrew, in which the Bible was written, there is no word for supernatural. Everything that happens is what God does. It says that we may not understand how He does it. We have a very limited knowledge, and that's what science tells us. There are limits to our knowledge, and so we keep our minds open, that things can be done a different way. And that's one way of understanding how miracles could happen. And then eventually we get right down to it. The scientists will tell us that at rock bottom we're just a collection of atoms and molecules, and that's all. There's no spiritual nature. There's nothing real about spiritism or spirituality. It's a delusion. Now let's see whether that's really a scientific statement. Because it's certainly enough. We are made up of atoms of oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, various percentages, calcium, phosphorus, zinc, iron, and all we bits and pieces put together, and you've got a human being. And that's what you can analyse each of us down to. And Francis Crick, who discovered the structure of DNA, he wrote this: you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are all in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. The italics there, I put that there. He's saying we're nothing more than a collection of atoms and molecules. Now, is that a scientific statement? I want to show you and question that and think a little bit more about that. Because some of you who are my generation may remember this couple. Hands up if you remember George Burns and Gracie Allen. These were an American couple who had a TV program, and at the end of it, they'd come out and have a little chat. It was a comedy, and George would say to Gracie, "Oh, how are you?" And Gracie said, "Well, I'm very well. My nephew's doing some scientific research," she said once. And George says, "Such a cigar. What's he researching?" And Gracie said, "Oh, he's trying to find out how many people in California have a telephone." "Well," said George, "and what did he find out?" "Well," said Gracie, "it was 100%. "Oh, that's interesting," said George. "How did he find that out?" "Well," said Gracie, "everybody he phoned up had one." Now, of course, when we, as scientists, design an experiment to do some research, we're very careful not to bias the results by the method we use. But inevitably, the methods we use in science can discover only the things that those methods can find. So science can only discover natural physical causes for the effects that we observe. It's limited in that sense. So, and philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe puts it this way: it often happens in philosophy and in science, it's argued that all we find is such and such. And it turns out that the arguer has excluded from his idea of finding the sort of things he says we don't find. And that's precisely what science does. It rules out any kind of non-physical action or being, and results in measuring just the physical causes that lead to the physical effects that we see. That's all it can do. But that doesn't mean there isn't anything else beyond it. It's an assumption of science. It's not a finding of science that we don't find a spiritual nature in our beings, in human beings. You can reduce us to a bunch of atoms, but that's not saying everything that you could say about a human being. So, there's an even bigger problem here that was spotted by an atheist, actually, J.B.S. Haldane, the very famous evolutionary biologist. Because when you think about it, and that's what we're trying to do, remember, think a bit more deeply, this idea of materialism, for that's what it's called, that we're just made of stuff and that's all there is. There's no spiritual reality and therefore no God. We're just a bunch of atoms. That means that what's going on in our minds when we're thinking is just what atoms are doing. In words of Francis Crick, nothing more than the bumping together of atoms and molecules in our brain that lead to our thoughts. And Haldane puts it this way: if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason to suppose my brain to be composed of atoms. So what he's saying is that if materialism is true, then it can't be true. Because if materialism is true, then even our thoughts are based on non-rational processes. And if all your argument is based on an illogical starting point, then you can't trust the result. And material is stuck in that way. It can't get out of that. So we have a problem here. And that means that, if you like, there has to be more to it than just atoms and molecules. But this is the fatal flaw of materialism, that says there's no such thing as spiritual reality. Because to do that would just say that even our thinking that there's no such thing as God is just a result of atoms and molecules, and therefore it's not a logical statement that can be said to be true. So the materialist is cutting off the branch he's sitting on. It's as it were proof that there are no proofs. And it just doesn't make sense. There has to be something else that gives our reasoning, our rationality, a solid basis. Now it turns out that science actually can't do that. Because there was a very clever person, one of the most clever people ever to have lived, in the words of Albert Einstein, recognized one of the brains of the 20th century. A young man called Kurt Gödel came up with a theorem about mathematics, which is a mathematical, logical system, and he says that within mathematics, or any logical structure, some statements within a system may be true, but are not provable within that system. In other words, you can have something like maths or any logical system of arguments and make statements which are true, but you cannot prove them to be true. You need something at a different level, a transcendent level as it were, that encompasses that lower level of your maths or your science. So there's a basic theoretical problem here that the materialist is just stuck with, because it means that you need something outside your logical system to validate your reason. In other words, we need something outside our system to have faith in that means our reasoning makes sense. So materialism says there is nothing outside the natural system, and therefore there's nothing that can validate our reason, and our rationality can't be trusted. Now, it wasn't just these smart guys, Gödel and Haldane, who recognized this problem, because actually it goes way back to Aristotle, who was thinking about our reason. And he quoted this little phrase that was going around at the time, that if a man chokes on water, with what will he wash it down? So if you've got doubts about your reason, you can't use reason to validate it. You need something outside reason to validate it. And if the materialist or the naturalist is right, there is nothing outside it. There is no God. But for the theist, we can trace our rationality back to the mind of God. In some way we are connected to that mind behind the universe. This was pointed out by Pascal, another very famous scientist, who says that the supreme function of our reason is to show man that some things are beyond reason. In other words, we have to just accept the fact that our reason needs an external validation. which points beyond itself. So what I'm suggesting here is that science may be, when it gets to the edge of its limits, pointing beyond itself, so that at the end of the day, science is not a foe of Christianity, because if we looked at these arguments in a little bit more depth, we see that they don't stand up. They don't have a sound logical basis. And so they may not be friends, but foes, but are they friends? So let's start off with something that they do agree upon. And is both science and Christianity agree that the universe had a beginning. We talked about the Big Bang, did we not? Okay. So, remember the Big Bang? So it starts 13.5 billion years ago, this sudden fluctuation in the vacuum, and quantum mechanics gives this explosion, and then gravity and so on takes over. And then when we finally look in more detail at what happened in the universe and what is going on now, we see that what we have here is a universe that was fine-tuned for life. In other words, there's so many things that are right in the universe to make it possible for us to be here that it cries out for an explanation. Did it just happen by pure chance? Well, you know, if you're playing a game of chance, and playing a game of dice, and you throw a 6, and then you throw another 6, and every time you throw it, you get a 6, you begin to wonder, there's something wrong with this dice. It's not pure chance anymore. So every time you do it, and it comes up with the same number, increases the probability that it's not pure chance, that there's something going on here. So you multiply the probability, it's 1 in 6 the first time you do it, 1 in 6 the second time you do it, and therefore that's 1 in 36 when you get it twice, okay? And so on, you multiply those probabilities, because each throw is independent. So if you've got independent things with a certain probability, you have to multiply them to get the total probability. Now it turns out, to get a universe that has us in it, a great number of things have to be just right. Very precisely right. Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, who's not a believer, also points this out here with this book called Just 6 Numbers, and he picks out 6 fundamental constants of nature. Things like the strength of the nuclear forces, the rate of expansion of the universe, things like that have a special value in order for to get the universe that we observe, and one that supports life like us. Now there's so many of these, and the probability of one of them being right is very small, so we have the exact value. And then the probability of the next one being just right, you've got to multiply them together. And there's so many of these, and the precision with which they have to be right is astonishing. People don't really realise till they look at the numbers. And this happened to another atheist scientist called Fred Hoyle, and it became apparent that there was more carbon in the universe than there should be. According to the normal laws of quantum mechanics and nuclear physics, carbon is produced in the centre of stars by 3 helium atoms or nuclei colliding together. I'll show you a wee picture here. Here's our 3 little helium atoms, or nuclei, 2 protons plus charges and 2 neutrons, little blue ones. And 3 of these have to come together at the same time in the same place. Now 2 atoms colliding happens all the time. To get 3 is much less likely. And then to have them stick together is even more unlikely, because the forces between them, the plus electric forces would force them apart. They wouldn't stick. Now, Hoyle looked at this and said, there's something funny going on here, because they shouldn't stick together like that in the quantities that they do. And so he worked out that there must be something called a resonance, that when these 3 particles get together, they like to be together, they kind of resonate together. And so it increases the probability of them sticking. And therefore they don't just fly apart again. And he did the sums and worked out where the energy, where this resonance should be. And then they did some experiments. And what do you know? There it was, just where Hoyle had predicted to be. And this explained the anomalous abundance of carbon, that the forces between the nuclei were just at the right value to make this possible. And he came up with this. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that the super intellect, some kind of mind behind the universe, has monkeyed with the physics, fiddled with things. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now Fred Hoyle is pointing here to something funny going on, and he wasn't a Christian, far from it, he was an atheist. So much so that he disliked the idea that the universe had a beginning, because he believed the universe had always existed, that matter had always existed. The Greeks sometimes thought that as well. And they even came up with the idea that as the universe expanded, new matter was being created to fill the space. He didn't like the idea of the Big Bang because it sounded a bit religious, a creation event. And in fact, it was him who called it the Big Bang, kind of pejorative term, but it stuck. And so Hoyle was pointing to this very notion that behind the universe we see, there seems to be a logical mind at work, adjusting things to make it just right for us to exist. And there's more to it than that. Because it turns out when you look at the world around us, we find a huge degree of order all through the universe. When we look at the light coming from this lamp here, from the atoms in that molecule, in that light source, and then look at the light from the same atoms at the other side of the universe, we find they're exactly the same. That the laws of physics governing what's going on here on Earth are the same everywhere in the universe. And the degree of order that we find in the laws of nature is just astounding. One of the important things in physics is what's called entropy or disorder. And as you know, everything is getting more and more disordered. I know my life is getting more disordered, but anyway, I look at a teenager's bedroom, you know what disorder means. It never spontaneously orders itself back in again. And when you put the milk in your tea, it never spontaneously separates. It just gets more diffuse. That's called the second law of thermodynamics. Things get more chaotic as time goes on. And that's the law of nature. And so when you look at the universe and we see the amount of order and disorder that we have, you can kind of work back to the Big Bang to see how ordered the state had to be in order after 3.5 billion years to get the amount of order we have today. That's a difficult sum, but Sir Roger Penrose, great mathematician, Nobel Prize winner, works in physics department in Oxford. He worked out the degree of order that had to exist in order to get our universe. And it is 1 part in 10 multiplied to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That's the precision that was needed in the degree of order. Now, by precision I mean, if I want to measure my height, I am at 1.5 meters, okay? Plus or minus 1 millimeter, okay? So that's the precision, 1 in 1,000. That isn't just 1 in 1,000 or 1 in a million. That's 1 in 10 with 123 noughts after it. Okay? That number is more than all the protons in the universe. That's a degree of precision that had to be just right to get the universe that we observe. And Penrose, who's not a believer, an atheist, he'd say that the universe has a purpose. It's not there just somehow by chance. So what Dawkins was saying, that science shows that the universe has no purpose, doesn't square when you actually get deep into the physics of it. And Penrose says that, he goes on to say, I think that there's something much deeper about it. In other words, when you really get into it and look at the numbers, chance doesn't explain it. There has to be something more. So what is that? Well, that's an interesting question. How did we get to where we are with our science? If we go back to before science was invented, as it were, right to the beginning even of religions, the ancient Babylonians had this idea that the universe was totally chaos. And the order we see in it was brought about by the god Marduk slaying this sea monster called Tiamat, which was the personification of chaos. And out of that struggle, humanity was created. And humans and so on were created to be the slaves of the gods. And basically things are chaotic. And therefore, there's no law of nature. There aren't any laws of physics because it's totally chaos. At rock bottom, it's all chaotic and unpredictable. That idea pervaded Greek and Roman religion as well. They had this idea of many gods who just acted independently and at their own whim, as it were. And so human life was subject to the whims or caprice of the gods. They had a goddess called Fortuna, who determined the outcome of people's lives, depended on whether she could steer your life into a catastrophe or pour out her horn of plenty and bless you. It was just up to her what she felt like. And there was no point in trying to make any sense of it, because the gods just did what they wanted to do. There was no order behind the universe. And therefore there's no point in looking for it. And so, why do science? Why try to find laws of nature? And so they didn't. And it wasn't until the input, as it were, of the God of the Jewish and Christian Bible that comes along, and they've introduced this idea of a God who created mankind in his own image. The image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, and God blessed them. As famous words from the book of Genesis. So, what the writer of Genesis was saying was that the universe, the world that we see, is not just chaotic. It isn't the product of various gods just doing what they feel like. There's only one God who made the world in an ordered, predictable, rational way. That's the whole theme. To contrast the religions of his time, the writer of Genesis was saying, no, all these suns and stars aren't gods. They were made by the one God. And that's why we can understand it. So, and also the point is that we are not made just to be the slaves of the gods to do their bidding. We are made to be loved by God. That's a revolutionary concept in the religions of the time. And it's taken up by John's Gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. We begin to see here that Christianity is pointing beyond the science to the purpose and meaning of our lives. Something that science of its nature can never discover. So, we've got this Christianity saying that there's a God who made the world in a rational, ordered way, in comparison to a chaotic universe where there are no laws of nature. And so, Kepler comes along in the early Middle Ages and says that as scientists, our aim, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world, is to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed upon it by God, and which he has revealed to us in the language of mathematics. Now, you may not like maths, but it turned out to be very useful for describing how the world works. And in fact, that's another kind of miracle, because why should maths work so well? It seems to be separate from nature, but yet it seems to work so well. Our rationality, our mathematics, seems to understand the way the world is. And scientists from Bacon and Kepler and Newton onwards started to look for the order that God would have placed there, even if it wasn't apparent. And by doing experiments, we could discover that order. And that faith, as it were, it was faith. Faith in a rational order led to the development of modern science. So faith in this created order was what got our modern science going. It got going in a Christian culture, in European societies, that believed that there was a rational God behind the universe. And therefore, not only was just science pointing to God, it was producing evidence of his ordered creation. So, to put it more succinctly, Charles Hummel writes this: by purging the cosmic order of all the gods and goddesses, the Genesis creation account de-divinized nature, took the gods out of nature, and made way for science that can probe and study every part of the universe without fearing either trespass or retribution. Many animist religions and so on fear that you cannot play with nature or do anything to it in case you anger the gods. And that's what inhibited experimental science, because you might get a thunderbolt from Thor or somebody if you interfered with what he was doing. And so, in getting rid of all those gods and pointing just to one God behind it who had a rational order to things, you could do these experiments without fear. So in this way, Christianity laid the groundwork for modern science. So, put it more precisely, von Weizsäcker, who's a famous German philosopher and scientist, writes this: that the concept of the exact mathematical laws of nature, which is only dimly present in Greek thought, gained far greater convincing power by the means of the Christian concept of creation. It was a sort of Christian radicalism, which transformed nature from the house of gods into the realm of law. In other words, when Christianity came along, it said it's worthwhile to look for laws of nature. Because when you look for them, you'll find them, because there's a rational order behind it, because it was made by God, who works in a rational, understandable way. And the fact that we discover these laws of nature indicates that there's a lawgiver. Where did those laws come from? Was Hawking's question, where did the laws of quantum theory come from? What got the Big Bang going? There has to be something behind it all. And these very laws are pointing to that. So science is actually pointing back to the God of Christianity. So what we've been saying is here, we can understand the world through our science, but that in itself, when you think about it, is really odd. This little brain that we have, a tiny bit of matter in the whole universe, can actually become aware of itself and understand what the universe is doing and how it works. Einstein says this, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. And if you're a materialist, you can't understand it either, because we're just bunches of atoms, there's nothing else. Einstein wasn't a materialist. He was a determinist. He didn't believe in a personal God. He believed in some kind of God because he understood the nature of science very deeply, and it pointed beyond itself. He couldn't accept a personal God for other reasons, which you can go into later. But he realized that science is telling us something here, and we need to pay attention to it. So, pure science has its limits. It can take us so far. So, the Christian answer is that to this question is that God created mankind in his own image. So there's something about us that's a bit like God. And the way we think is a bit like the way God thinks. Kepler said that science is thinking God's thoughts after him. So there's something that relates our thinking to God. Our reason, our rationality has its basis in the mind of God. How that works, we don't know. But it makes sense that it does. We need something outside our reason to validate it. And so Christian theory does that. We have our God-given reason to understand the world, and which points beyond itself back to the Creator. So John puts this at the beginning of his Gospel. In his very words, he says, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek word there was logos. And the word logos was with God, and the word logos was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Now this Greek word logos had the idea of it being a rational principle that underlay how things worked. And so the word, the creation, was done in a logical, rational way. And the person who did it became flesh to reveal himself to us in the form of Jesus. And that's what the whole Gospel of John is about. How the Word, God himself, made himself available to us in a more limited way, but pointing again to the Creator. He was the one who made the world. And that's why we can understand it, that we have something of God in our minds, that we can think the way he does. So, when we get back to Bacon's quote, you see how sensible it was. You know, a little superficial introduction to science would make you think there's no God and atheism is right, but when you think of it more deeply, you find actually it points back to God. And that requires us to really think a bit more deeply, because these are important questions. Because it could be that Christianity is supporting science, and that science is giving some evidence for God, but it's not giving us a proof. And there may be reasons for that, which we can discuss afterwards. But certainly science is not an enemy of Christianity. It's actually more of a friend, because it's pointing evidence back towards the existence of the God that we believe in. But maybe you can say, well, because there's no proof, I just have to say I don't know. I'll just be agnostic. And maybe one could argue that's the most honest thing to do. If we can't tell for sure, we can't be certain, we just have to be agnostic. Well, C.S. Lewis, another Belfast man, said this: Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So this question about Christianity and science is a serious, important question for all of us, because it bears upon the whole meaning of our lives, why we're here, and what our purpose is, and where we're going. It's too important a question just to shrug our shoulders and say, we can't know, we can't ever discover it. Because science, as we've seen, has its limitations. It's brilliant at doing what it does, but it can only take us so far. So what it will say to us is, well, maybe we can look at other evidence than scientific evidence that will help us know a bit more. One of the things we could think about, and we haven't time to go into completely tonight, is our moral sense. Not just that we have a sense behind the world, that there's some rational mind there, but that we have a deep-seated sense of right and wrong. And that's not just true of us here in Northern Ireland. It's true of humanity all over the world and all through history. People might disagree about, certain aspects of how you live together, but there's a common idea of justice, of fairness, of good and evil. It's common to all men and women of all times. This moral sense that we just somehow know is there. We can't prove it, but we just know that torturing babies is wrong. Can't prove it, we just know it. And have that moral sense, this moral compass that we all have, that we can pay attention to or ignore, and eventually it will stop working if we keep ignoring it, but we have a built-in sense of what's right and wrong. And then we have the historical evidence of Jesus. Well-attested historical evidence that this man lived, he died on the cross, and that he rose again. And the evidence of it, I'll be talking a little bit more about that on Sunday morning, but there is good historical evidence for the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. There's also the historical evidence of the effect he had on the world, of the experience of men and women and children all down the ages who have trusted in him and found their lives transformed. Of how Christianity has transformed the culture of the world. How we stopped in Roman times throwing babies on rubbish tips if they weren't wanted. How we started to care for the poor. People in ancient times didn't care for the poor, it was their fault. There was a hierarchy of human beings. The whole idea of human rights came out of the church's laws in the Middle Ages. Christianity was the basis for a radical change in the way we live as human beings today. As Jesus said, Christians were to be salt and light, to affect and influence the world around us, and they have done that. So there's the evidence of the effect of Christianity in the world. Of course, people have abused religion and used it as excuses for wars and so on, but men and women do that for almost everything. But there's an undoubted evidence that the influence of Christianity has brought good. The invention of hospitals, of hospices, of education for everybody. That came out of a Christian culture. Then there's the human experience of God. That deep sense of the spiritual that all men and women have experienced to some degree in all cultures. There's a lovely story of a group of men who went into the forests of Papua New Guinea in the early days of the last century, and they found people living in the forest who'd never encountered white people. And their culture was one of constant warring with neighbouring villages and cutting their heads off and shrinking them. And the first encounter with the white men, one of the white men said to these tribespeople, do you believe in the Great Spirit? And they sort of sat and thought, yes, we have the spirits of the trees and the forest, spirits of the animals, spirits of the monkeys and so on. Yeah, there is a great spirit, but we don't worry about him because he's no threat, he doesn't hurt us, he's just there, as it were. They were afraid of all the other spirits of the forest. This was animist religion, but they had this idea that somewhere there was a great spirit. And so they said to them, do you think the great spirit would want you to be killing your neighbours? And they sat for a while and thought, well, we don't think he does. They were praying instinctively. And then they got into the villages and they found that the men were treating their wives abominably, casting them adrift and taking other ones. Women were disposable. And so they asked them again, do you think the Great Spirit wants you to treat your women like that? And again they gathered together and thought, no, we don't think the Great Spirit wants us to do that. So they were praying again to God. They didn't realize that word, but that's what they were doing. There's this common sense of the spiritual that's common to all men. You can read about that in a book called More Than Coincidence by a man called Dr. McLean. Just look it up on Google. Wonderful. I'm not sure whether he's a Christian or not, but he certainly recounts the effect of Christianity in his travels. So there's the human experience of God. People's lives are changed when they trust in Jesus. And then all I can say is my own personal experience as an experimental scientist. I found it made a difference in my life. And I only put that down to a reality that's beyond me. And it's an experience I think can be shared by anyone. There's nothing special about me. So I'll close with the words of another famous scientist, this time a man I had the privilege of getting to know when he worked in the same lab for a while in London. Arthur Schauer, he won the Nobel Prize for the invention of the laser. And he said this, that it seems to me that when confronted with the marvels of life and the universe, one must ask why and not just how. The only possible answers are religious, and I find a need for God in the universe and in my own life. So this, at the end of the day, really is not just an intellectual question. It's not just a philosophical puzzle as to whether there's a God or not. This is something that affects how we live, how we feel about the purpose of our life and the direction and the ultimate goal of our lives. And not something that science can give you the definitive answer to. But what I'm trying to show you tonight, that science is no obstacle to your faith. It's no real stumbling block to belief in God. In fact, Christianity gives us a rational justification for belief in God, and science points to it. So our faith is a rationally justified belief. So science and Christianity, I want to say to you, are more than just friends. And the question is more important than sometimes we realise. Therefore, we can't just shrug our shoulders and remain agnostic. We can consider the other evidence and look beyond science, giving us a pointer, and taking all the evidence on board, and then the personal journey that each of us has to make. And Jesus has said, if we ask, we will be given. If we seek, we will find. We need to have open minds and open hearts to the truth of Christianity. And science is no enemy, but a friend. Any questions?